As some have realized, not much is mentioned by Italian scholars about World War II before 1943. Part of the reason for this is because of the disappointing performance of the Italian military. Said disappointing performance can be summed up in a couple of words: low-quality stuff. But whilst that isn't the only reason, it is one of the biggest contributors, especially when paired with the lack of personnel and equipment. The other reasons include the fact that the Italian military archives were kept in a poor state, and that the Italian and fascist governments and their economies were not ready for this. So going on to the very first point, which was the low-quality stuff paired with the lack of personnel and equipment. With the army, in June of 1940, Italy entered the war with a little less than 1.7 million soldiers and a total of 37 divisions. Of the 37 divisions, only 19 had the required amount of personnel, equipment, weapons, and transport capacity. Another 34 divisions were operational but lacked personnel and transport capacity. The last 20 divisions lost more than 50% of their personnel, a significant amount of equipment, and 50% of their transport capacity. Obviously, that's a pretty big deal. Up next, we have the Italian military archives, of which there isn't very much information on, unsurprisingly, because they weren't very well kept. The result of this problem is the dichotomy of the good Italian and the bad German, and the focus on the Italian resistance and its fight against Nazi and Republican fascist forces between 1943 and 1945 became more obvious. That dichotomy I mentioned earlier was further buttressed by the equally simplistic paradigm in which the Italian soldier was prone to cowardice and incapable of waging war, while conversely, the average German soldier was lauded for his tenacity and Wehrmacht units admired for their esprit de corps. Thus, the myth of the Italian good fellow was coupled with the stereotype of the Italian bad soldier. The Italian soldiers were even seen by a famous military historian as a burden supported by the German army, as just useless ballast. Another point to make is that the Italian and fascist government and their economy wasn't really ready at the time. When Italy entered World War II, part of that is because Italy had a limited amount of industries which weren't properly prepared for arms production. Because Italy also had a severe lack of resources, the allocation of said resources and organization was limited. The wars in Ethiopia and Spain required more of those resources that the Italians couldn't spare, even more so when all those conflicts dragged on for far longer than anticipated. As a result, the Italian forces just were not ready when the war started in 1939. Mussolini, in order to enlarge the size of his army, in fact, instituted the binary infantry divisions. This means that each division only had 2 brigades of infantry as opposed to the 3 or 4 of other nations. So right off the bat, the average Italian infantry division is going to be weaker than its counterparts. This came into play in Greece and France when stronger Greek and French infantry divisions were able to easily repel the more numerous Italian infantry divisions. And now lastly, to get into the last point that really kind of sealed the coffin on this one, was the loss of morale. As the war went on, art disappeared, either destroyed, stolen, or hidden for its safety. Unfortunately, some of the most famous buildings in Italy experienced severe damage due to bombing raids. Amongst these are the Camposanto Monumentale and the Monte Cassino. The first one that I mentioned was the Camposanto Monumentale, which was destroyed when on July 27, 1944, a bomb fragment from an Allied raid started a fire. Due to all the water tanks being controlled, the fire could not be put out in time, and unfortunately it burned the wooden rafters and melted the lead of the roof. The destruction of the roof severely damaged everything inside the cemetery, destroying most of the sculptures and sarcophagi and compromising all of the frescoes within. Camposanto Monumentale was a very historic cultural site, more famous than the Leaning Tower of Pisa before its destruction. Now very few people know of it, which is very, very unfortunate because it is quite beautiful. The second building I mentioned, the Monte Cassino, on February 15th, 1944, it was almost completely destroyed in a series of heavy American-led air raids. The commander-in-chief of the Allied armies in Italy, General Sir Harold Alexander of the British Army, ordered the bombing. The bombing was conducted because many reports from the British commanders of the Italian troops on the ground suggested that Germans were occupying the monastery, and it was considered a key observational post by all those who were fighting in the field. However, during the bombing, no Germans were present in the abbey. Subsequent investigations have since confirmed that the only people killed in the monastery by the bombing were the 230 Italian civilians seeking refuge there.